Sometimes the strongest bond isn't forged by blood or words, but by something silent, a loyalty that survives storm's fire and the cruelty of the streets. This story begins with a veteran who had nothing left to fight for, and a wounded dog who refused to die quietly. What they discover together will break your heart before it heals it. Stay with us, and if this journey moves, you subscribe and tell us where you're watching from.
She's gonna be all—
The rain had turned the streets of the city into rivers sweeping trash and shattered glass into the gutters where no one looked twice. Wind howled through the bridge supports, carrying echoes of sirens and the distant thrum of traffic. Underneath that bridge, in the shadowed heart of the city, two stories were about to meet, one belonging to a broken soldier who had given up on life, and the other to a dog who refused to let life go. The storm raged, lightning flashing in fractured arcs across the skyline, revealing a stray shepherd mother crawling through the mud. Her name was Lyra, and she was barely alive. Her ribs pressed against her torn coat, her fur matted and streaked with blood and grime. Each step she took left a red print that quickly vanished beneath the rising water. Lyra had lost everything: her home, her strength, and the litter she'd fought to keep alive, until the flood took them. But still she searched, driven by a hollow instinct that whispered there was something left to protect. Then she heard a sound that barely existed at all, a fragile cry drowned by thunder. She stopped dead, lifting her head. The sound came again, thinner this time, from the far side of the underpass near the drainage ditch. Her paws splashed as she limped toward it, ears pressed back against the cold wind. There, half buried in garbage and water, was a collapsed cardboard box. The smell of rot clung to it, but beneath that she caught another scent: fear. Inside, a tiny shepherd mix puppy lay still, its chest fluttering with shallow breaths. Its eyes were crusted shut, its small body shaking violently. It was alone, discarded, the kind of life no one noticed. Lyra nosed the box, whining softly. Her tail twitched. Something inside her chest, long frozen, cracked open. She wanted to turn away. She was weak, bleeding, and the storm was getting worse. But that cry, that faint plea for life, was the same sound she'd once heard from her own pups before the river swallowed them. And so with one trembling step she chose to stay. The storm's voice deepened, echoing beneath the bridge like a growl. The cardboard box began to shift as the current grew stronger. The waterline rose, turning the gutter into a rushing stream. Lyra barked a hoarse, broken sound and lunged forward, placing her paws on the edge of the box. But before she could drag it to safety, the surge came. The floodwater exploded from the culvert with violent force, slamming into the box and sweeping it down the channel. Without a second thought, Lyra dove after it. The cold hit her like a bullet, stealing her breath. She fought to keep her head above water as the current spun her sideways, crashing her against concrete. Pain seared through her body, but her eyes never left the box, tumbling ahead. She kicked with all of the strength left in her, closing the distance until her teeth clamped down on the corner of the soaked cardboard. The taste of dirt and oil filled her mouth. The current dragged her toward the drainage grate, a roaring black maw where everything disappeared. She pulled sideways claws, scraping the concrete wall. Inch by inch, she fought for ground. Her hind legs slipped. The water tore at her fur, but she didn't let go. Finally, with a desperate lunge, she slammed against a shallow rise of gravel and hauled the box onto it. The current hissed past her, furious but defeated. Lyra collapsed beside the wrecked box, her chest heaving. Her sides bled where the concrete had shredded her skin. The storm above began to fade into a heavy drizzle. For a moment she thought she had failed. The pup inside didn't move. She pushed her nose inside, licking the cold fur twice. Nothing. She whimpered, then pressed her muzzle harder against his chest. And then there, a faint tremor, a heartbeat fragile but real. The pup gasped, his lungs finally catching air. Lyra froze, her ears flicking back as her tail gave a single twitch. She leaned down and licked the mud from his muzzle again, slower this time, the way she once did for her own. His breathing steadied. The rain slowed to a patter against the bridge. The world, for one quiet second, held its breath. Lyra lay beside him, curling her body protectively around his small frame. Warmth bled from her chest into his faint but steady. Above them, cars thundered across the bridge, unaware that life was being reclaimed in the shadows beneath. The pup whimpered again, softer now, pressing his head against her chest as if he knew he was safe. The ache in her body dulled. The emptiness inside her filled with that sound, the fragile rhythm of survival. She sighed, a deep, trembling sound that rose from both pain and peace. And in that sigh lived something sacred, the promise to keep him alive no matter what it cost. The morning would bring light and noise, maybe danger, maybe salvation. Dawn's cold light revealed the marks on her body. Deep scratches across her side, a broken nail, the faint scar of a chain long removed. She sniffed the air, cautious. The world above had awakened again, and the danger of men returned with it. Tires hissed through puddles. Footsteps echoed faintly overhead, and voices drifted through the morning haze. She glanced down at the pup, nudged him softly awake. His eyes blinked open for the first time, murky, unfocused, but searching. He whimpered, pressing close to her belly. She licked his ear once, then twice before crouching low and scanning the path ahead. It was time to move. The bridge had kept them alive through the night, but the scent of the river was rising again. She picked up the pup gently by the scruff and began the slow climb up the slope of broken concrete toward the street. The sun broke through the clouds for a fleeting second, reflecting off puddles like shards of glass. She moved carefully, limping on one leg, the pup swinging lightly from her jaws. Above, a man approached from the east side of the bridge, his figure tall, wrapped in an old brown military coat, the collar pulled high against the chill. His name was Elias Ward, a black veteran who had long since stopped counting the years since he came home. He walked with a measured limp, his duffel slung over one shoulder, a faded patch reading U.S. Navy stitched near the strap. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes, dark, deep, and hollow, carried a weight only silence could hold. The streets didn't see him anymore. He was invisible, a man moving through the city like smoke. Elias had slept behind a bus depot the night before, dreaming of waves and fire, of brothers who never made it back. When he woke, he followed the rhythm of rain and ended up here under the bridge where the city's veins met the river's mouth. That was where he saw her. The shepherd mother emerged from the mist, limping, her fur clumped and dark with mud. In her jaws hung a small bundle of life, a pup still trembling from the storm. She stopped when she saw him, hackles rising, tail stiff. Elias froze, his instincts sharp from years of reading danger. He raised both hands slowly. "Easy there, Mama," he murmured. His voice was gravel, low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." She growled a low sound that rumbled like a warning, her body arching protectively around the pup. Elias crouched down, ignoring the cold soaking through his pants. "You're bleeding," he said softly. "You did good, girl." The dog's ears twitched, uncertain. The city hummed behind them, the smell of wet concrete and gasoline heavy in the air. Then it happened. A delivery truck roared around the corner too close to the curb. Its tires sliced through a gutter full of filthy rainwater and sent a wave crashing toward them. The splash hit both Elias and Lyra, drenching them. Lyra snapped, startled by the shock, and lunged forward with a snarl. Her teeth flashed inches from his arm, her growl fierce and raw, all instinct and fear. Elias didn't move. Instead of stepping back or shouting, he simply turned his body, wrapping his arms around the puppy to shield it from the freezing spray. He didn't even flinch when Lyra's claws grazed his coat. For a second, the world seemed to pause, the truck's roar fading into silence, the wind dying down. Lyra stopped mid-snarling breath, her amber eyes wide and uncertain. This man, this stranger, hadn't fought back. He'd protected the pup. Her breathing slowed, confusion flickering in her mind where only fear had lived before. Elias lowered his head slightly, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "It's all right," he whispered. "You got him this far. Let me help now." Slowly he unzipped his coat and revealed a dry cloth he'd kept wrapped around his duffel. He used it to dab at the puppy's face, careful not to startle the mother. The pup shivered, then sneezed, curling against the warmth of his hand. Elias smiled faintly. Hey there, little one. The sound of his laugh, rough and quiet, made Lyra tilt her head. Something about it was familiar. It was the same sound her old owner used to make when calling her in from the yard. She relaxed just slightly enough to let her tail drop from its stiff curve. Elias extended his hand again, palm up, fingers open. See no tricks. I'm just passing through. Lyra sniffed the air. The man smelled of rain tobacco and something faintly metallic gun oil, maybe old and fading. But beneath that there was another scent, grief. It was the kind that lingered longer than wounds heavy but honest. Her ears drooped and she let out a low sigh, stepping back half an inch. The gesture was small, but it was trust. Elias took it gently. You're a soldier too, huh? He murmured. Lost your unit, didn't you? The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They weren't really for her. They were for himself. The pup whimpered, and Elias reached into his pocket, pulling out the last scrap of bread he had. He tore it in half, offering one piece to Lyra. Go on, girl. You earned it. She hesitated, then stepped forward, teeth brushing his fingers as she took it. Her touch was soft. For the first time in years, Elias felt the warmth of another living creature trusting him even for a second. He looked down at the pup, now nestled between them, still shivering, but breathing easier. We'll get you both warm, he said quietly. The street smelled of wet asphalt and morning coffee, as Elias trudged forward, his breath visible in the chill. Beside him, Lyra limped slowly, keeping one wary eye on him, and the other on the world around her. The pup nestled inside his coat barely made a sound, its small warmth pressed against the fading patch that read, U.S. Navy. Cars passed, some slowing long enough for their passengers to stare before accelerating again. To them, Elias was just another man who'd fallen off the grid, another broken soldier dragging ghosts through the city. He ignored them. His focus was on the two lives now walking beside him. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt washed out, painted in shades of gray. Lyra's paws left faint tracks behind her, blood mingling with the dirt. Each step she took seemed to cost her more than the last, yet she never let the man or the pup out of her sight. Elias spotted the faded blue cross of a veterinary clinic at the end of the street and quickened his pace. The glass doors slid open as he approached, releasing a burst of disinfectant smell and warm air that felt almost heavenly after the cold. Inside, bright lights hummed. A woman at the reception desk looked up, her smile fading when she saw him. His clothes were soaked and stained, his beard uneven, his boots worn to the threads. Behind him stood a bleeding dog, and in his arms a sickly pup. Please, Elias said quietly, his voice rough but polite. They need help. The receptionist frowned, glancing toward a sign that read, Payment required upon service. Sir, she began carefully, we're not a shelter. We treat registered animals with confirmed owners. Do you have an account? Elias shook his head, pulling out his wallet and showing the crumpled bills inside $27. This is all I have. Take it. Just patch them up. The little one's freezing. The woman hesitated, her eyes softening for a moment before she looked at the clock. I'm sorry, sir. Policy. There's a city clinic a few blocks east that takes strays. Elias's jaw tightened. They won't last that long. The woman's smile thinned. Sir, you're disrupting business. A man in scrubs stepped out from the back, frowning. Is there a problem here? The receptionist gestured toward Elias. Homeless man with strays. Says it's an emergency. The man's eyes hardened. We can't allow that in here. Security, please. Lyra, sensing danger, moved closer to Elias, pressing against his leg. Her ears flattened, and a low growl escaped her throat. A security guard approached from the hallway, hand resting casually on the pepper spray at his belt. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Elias lifted his hands. Look, I'm not asking for charity. Just now, sir. The guard stepped closer, his boot brushing Lyra's paw. She snapped before anyone could stop her, teeth flashing, as she lunged forward with a snarl that echoed through the clinic. The guard stumbled back, tripping over a chair, shouting. The receptionist screamed. "That dog's dangerous," she cried. "Call animal control." Elias dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around Lyra's neck. "Easy, girl, easy," he pleaded, holding her back as she thrashed in panic. "She's scared." The pup in his coat began to cry, a thin, pained sound that silenced the chaos for a moment. Everyone stared, Elias clutching the wounded mother, his voice breaking the guard, frozen mid-reach. The vet muttered, "Sir, if you don't leave, we'll have to report this." Elias's shoulders slumped. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You'd report me for trying to save what's left of my squad." He stood still, holding Lyra close, and turned toward the door. The staff looked away as he limped out into the cold, again the doors sliding shut behind him with a hiss that felt like a verdict. Outside, the light was harsh. The city didn't care about his pleading voice or the blood on his hands. He walked down the block, head bowed, Lyra pressing close to his side, as if afraid he'd vanish. The pup whimpered, and Elias adjusted his coat to keep it warm. He reached an alley and leaned against the wall, his leg aching from the strain. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You didn't bite him. You just wanted to protect him, huh?" Lyra blinked up at him, her breath fogging the air. Her ears twitched at the faint sound of a door creaking behind them. Elias turned to see the clinic's side door crack open just a few inches. A young woman in scrubs barely more than 20 peeked out. She held something in her hand. "Hey," she whispered urgently. "Wait." Elias hesitated but didn't move closer. The woman stepped out, glancing both ways before hurrying toward him. She pressed a small piece of paper into his palm. "You didn't hear this from me," she said quickly. "They'll fire me if they know. There's a shelter on Harlan Street, Second Chance Rescue. It's run by volunteers. They don't turn anyone away. Not humans, not animals." Elias stared at her, the rain dripping from his brow. "Why are you helping me?" She shrugged, eyes glistening. "Because once someone helped me, too." She looked at the pup nestled in his coat and smiled faintly. "Keep walking, sir. Don't give up on them." Before he could reply, she was gone, the door closing behind her. The sun sank behind the city's skyline, smearing the wet streets in bruised shades of orange and steel. Elias and Lyra had been walking for hours following the fading memory of directions scrawled on a rain-soaked card. Harlan Street wasn't close. It twisted through the city's oldest neighborhoods, where the broken and forgotten gathered like ghosts. Every few blocks, Elias had to stop to catch his breath, his leg stiff from the cold, but he never let go of the duffel that held his few belongings. Lyra limped beside him, her flank still bleeding from the storm, her head turning every few seconds as if expecting danger to crawl out of the shadows. The pup, small and tired, slept against Elias's chest inside the folds of his jacket, breathing shallowly, but steady. The veteran spoke softly as they walked, his voice a mix of exhaustion and habit. "Almost there, kid," he said. "You hang on all right, your mom's tougher than both of us combined." His words were more for himself than for the pup. The city grew quieter as they crossed the boundary into the warehouse district. Stores were shuttered, windows boarded, and alleyways littered with the smell of decay. The only light came from flickering street lamps, their glow reflecting on wet pavement like candlelight in a forgotten church. Elias spotted an alley tucked between an abandoned bakery and a pawn shop. It was dry enough to rest. He leaned against the wall and slid down until he was sitting on the ground, his back pressed to cold brick. He pulled the pup out, wrapping it in his scarf, and poured a bit of rainwater from a bottle cap so it could lick. Lyra settled near him, curling up with her head on her paws. She closed her eyes but didn't sleep. Her ears twitched at every sound. The hum of the city felt distant here, replaced by the steady drip of water from a broken gutter. For a few minutes there was peace, brief and fragile. Elias took a deep breath, his chest tight with the weight of memory. "You know, girl," he murmured, glancing at Lyra, "I used to fix engines on ships. Machines don't judge you. They either work or they don't. People, they stop working and don't tell you why." Lyra looked up at him, eyes catching the faint light. For a second, it almost felt like she understood. Then footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. Elias froze. Two men emerged from the shadows, both wearing dark hoodies, one carrying a crowbar. Their movements were slow, deliberate, the kind that came from confidence born of desperation. The taller one grinned. "Look what we got here," he said, his voice sharp. "Old man with a bag and a dog. Bet there's something worth taking." Elias didn't move, his pulse quickening. "Walk away," he said evenly. "Ain't worth the trouble." The shorter man laughed. "Everything's worth something if you take it hard enough." He stepped closer, eyes flicking to the pup. "Cute little thing. Maybe I sell it to one of those dog rings." Lyra's head shot up, teeth bared. The low growl that escaped her was primal enough to make the men hesitate. The taller one swung the crowbar, striking the wall just inches above Elias's shoulder. "Call her off," he sneered, "or I'll split her in half." Elias's muscles tensed. His body remembered movement even when his mind screamed otherwise. Before he could act, Lyra lunged, a blur of fury and pain. She hit the man's leg teeth, sinking into his jeans, dragging him down with a shout. The other rushed forward, kicking her in the side. Elias moved faster than he had in years, rising despite the pain in his knee and slamming his fist into the second man's jaw. The crowbar clanged to the ground. Chaos exploded. The alley filled with shouting, snarling, and the sound of metal hitting concrete. Elias grabbed the crowbar, swinging it once to drive the taller man back. He shouted, "Run, girl," but Lyra didn't retreat. She circled him, growling, her body trembling. The second attacker spat blood and pulled a knife from his pocket. "You're dead, old man." He lunged, but before he could strike, Lyra threw herself between them. The knife slashed across her shoulder, and she yelped, collapsing to her knees. Rage burned through Elias like fire through oil. He swung the crowbar again, catching the man in the arm. The knife clattered away. The two attackers stumbled backward, their courage dissolving. The taller one grabbed his friend's arm. "He's nuts, man. Let's go." They fled, disappearing into the maze of streets beyond. Elias stood there, panting, the crowbar still trembling in his grip. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight. He dropped the weapon and fell to his knees beside Lyra. No, stay with me," he murmured, pressing a hand against her wound. Blood oozed between his fingers. She whined softly, her breathing shallow. The pup in his jacket began to stir, sensing the panic. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but gentle. She nudged the pup weakly with her nose, pushing him toward Elias, as if commanding him to take over. Elias felt his throat tighten. "Don't you do that," he whispered. "Don't give up on me. We're a unit now, remember?" The word unit caught in his chest. He hadn't used it since the Navy. For years he had lived with the ghosts of men he couldn't save. Now, in a filthy alley with no audience, he realized he was fighting the same battle all over again. He tore a strip of fabric from his undershirt and pressed it to her wound, tying it tight. "You did good, girl," he said, his voice breaking. The words echoed down the empty blocks, swallowed by the hum of faraway traffic. Lyra's breath rasped against his arm, wet and shallow. He could feel the tremor in her chest every few steps, but she didn't whine. The pup stirred occasionally, pressing its tiny head against his heart, as if searching for reassurance. The rhythm of that fragile heartbeat kept Elias moving. His leg ached with every step, but he refused to stop. After what felt like miles, he turned the corner and saw it, a narrow building wedged between a boarded-up pharmacy and a laundromat, its faded sign hanging crooked Second Chance Rescue. Relief crashed through him so suddenly that his knees almost buckled. "We made it," he whispered. "We damn well made it." He staggered up the cracked steps and reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. A chain was looped through the door handles, padlocked tight. His breath caught. He tried again, rattling the door until the noise echoed down the street. A paper was taped to the window, yellowed and torn. He leaned close to read it through the grime. Closed by city order. Property condemned. No trespassing. The letters blurred as his vision swam. "No," he muttered. "Not now. Not after all this." He slammed his fist against the glass. The sound rang hollow. Inside the building was dark, stripped bare. Empty cages, overturned chairs, a lone poster curling on the wall that read, "Every life matters." His reflection stared back at him, tired, filthy, desperate. "You said they'd help." He whispered to no one. He turned, sinking down onto the steps. The city stretched out before him, vast and uncaring. The wind tugged at his coat, and Lyra whimpered softly in his arms. He brushed his hand through her matted fur, feeling the faint pulse beneath. "You held the line, girl. You did your part," he said. "It's me who failed you." The pup made a faint sound from his chest, muffled by the fabric. He unzipped his coat and looked down. The tiny creature blinked weakly, its eyes cloudy but alive. He touched its head with trembling fingers. "You don't know what kind of world you got born into, kid." He laughed bitterly. "It chews you up before it ever feeds you." His laugh turned into a cough, rough and hollow. He looked back at the locked door, his eyes burning. For the first time in years, tears came. They cut through the dirt on his cheeks and fell onto Lyra's fur. "What's the point?" he whispered. "All that fighting, all that marching, and every damn door's the same." He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold concrete, his arms tightening around the 2 lives he had tried to save. The rain began again, light, cold, and merciless. It beaded on his coat, dripped down his neck. He didn't move. He was too tired. The kind of tired that goes deeper than muscle, that seeps into the bones. He whispered, "I'm sorry to no one, and everyone at once." That was when he heard it, the soft creak of a window opening. He looked up. Across the narrow alley, a light flickered on in a second-floor window. A silhouette appeared. A woman's voice called out sharp, but not cruel. "You out there with those dogs?" Elias blinked, unsure if he was hearing right. "Yes, ma'am," he called back. His voice breaking. "The shelter's closed. They're hurt. The window shut suddenly, and for a second he thought she'd gone. But moments later a door opened from the adjacent building. A woman stepped out, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf. She was older, her face lined with years, but her posture straight, her eyes sharp. "Lord have mercy," she murmured, hurrying toward him. "You look half dead yourself." She knelt beside him, her gaze falling to Lyra. "She's bleeding bad." Elias nodded, barely able to speak. "Tried to protect us." The woman looked up at him, eyes narrowing. "You're a vet." He hesitated. "Navy." She nodded once. "I knew it. You carry yourself like someone who's seen too much." Without another word, she rose and motioned toward the open door behind her. "Get inside, both of you." Elias stared at her, uncertain. "Ma'am, I don't argue with me." "Son," she cut in, "you bring that dog in before she bleeds out on my sidewalk." He didn't need telling twice. He lifted Lyra carefully, the pup still cradled against his chest, and followed her inside. The building smelled faintly of cinnamon and disinfectant. A heater hummed somewhere in the corner. The woman guided him into a small kitchen, cluttered but warm. She cleared a space on the table and gestured for him to set Lyra down. "Name's Evelyn," she said, pulling open a drawer. "Used to be a nurse. Still know how to clean a wound when I see one." Elias stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden warmth, the light, the sheer act of kindness. Evelyn shot him a look. "Don't just stand there, boy. Get me that towel by the sink." He obeyed, moving as if under orders. She worked quickly, cleaning Lyra's wound with antiseptic, her hands steady. "She's a fighter," she murmured. "So are you, I reckon." Elias swallowed hard. "Feels like I've been fighting ghosts." Evelyn glanced up. "Ain't we all?" Lyra flinched when the alcohol touched her cut, but she didn't pull away. The pup stirred in Elias's coat, and Evelyn smiled softly. "That little one yours. Found him in a ditch," Elias said quietly. "His mama didn't make it. This one saved him." Evelyn paused, studying him. "And who saved you?" He didn't answer. She nodded knowingly. "That's what I thought." When she finished, she wrapped Lyra in a blanket and handed Elias a mug of warm broth. He hesitated before sipping. The warmth spread through him, undoing the knots in his chest. "Why'd you help me?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled, her eyes tired but kind. "Because too many people walked past me once. Didn't sit right with my soul." Now I help who I can before my time runs out." She touched his hand. "You found that shelter for a reason, even if it's gone. Sometimes God closes buildings so we'll open hearts instead." Elias looked at her, unsure how to reply. The wind outside howled through the narrow streets like a warning that the city was never truly quiet. Inside Evelyn's small apartment, warmth held steady against the cold, a rare thing in a world that had forgotten gentleness. Elias sat in a creaky wooden chair near the window, his eyes half closed, but alert, watching Lyra and the pup sleep near the old radiator. The soft hum of the heater, mixed with the sound of Evelyn moving about the kitchen, humming faintly to herself as she washed the blood from a towel. The faint smell of broth and cinnamon hung in the air, the kind of comfort Elias had almost forgotten existed. He felt the ache in his body settle into a dull throb, the exhaustion finally catching up to him after days of running, fighting, and bleeding. He looked toward the corner where Lyra lay, her head resting near the pup, her breathing steadier now under the flickering lamplight. The sight made his chest tighten, the kind of ache that came not from pain, but from something deeper, gratefulness laced with fear. He whispered to himself, "You did, good girl." Evelyn's voice came from the doorway, gentle but firm. "She's strong. Reminds me of someone else in this room." Elias gave a faint smile. "She's got more fight than I ever had." Evelyn walked closer, wiping her hands on a rag. "You'd be surprised how much fight a soul's got when it ain't got nothing left to lose." She nodded toward the pup. "That one's gonna make it too. I can feel it." Elias followed her gaze and saw the pup twitch in sleep, pressing closer to its mother. "Yeah," he murmured. "He's got her spirit." The moment was quiet, fragile. But outside the wind carried footsteps, heavy, unsteady, and far too deliberate to be a stranger passing through. Elias frowned, glancing towards the window. A shadow moved in the alley below, then another. He leaned forward, his instincts prickling awake. He hadn't felt that kind of alertness since deployment, but some senses never dulled. "Evelyn?" he said quietly. "You expecting anyone?" She looked up from the sink, eyebrows drawn. At this hour, no sun. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He peered through the cracked blinds and felt his stomach drop. Two figures lingered near the edge of the streetlight, one leaning on the other's shoulder. Then one turned slightly, and Elias saw the jagged scar along his jaw, the same man from the alley, the one Lyra had bitten. His pulse spiked. "They found us," he muttered. Evelyn stepped closer. "What do you mean they found us?" "The ones who attacked us. They followed me here. Probably think I've got something worth taking." He moved away from the window, mind racing. "We need to lock the doors." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She crossed the room, sliding the deadbolt and shoving a chair under the handle. "You sure it's them?" I'm sure Elias said, checking his duffel. The knife wound had slowed them down, but it hadn't stopped their greed. He knew their kind. Men who chased scraps out of hunger-hate, or both. The type who saw weakness as invitation. The hallway light outside flickered, then went dark. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. "There's an old baseball bat by the door," she said. "If they try coming through, we make them regret it." Elias turned to her, surprised. "You're not afraid?" Evelyn gave him a hard look. "Son fears for folks who got someone left to call. The only thing that scares me is not standing up when I should." She pulled the bat, out its wood, worn smooth by time. Elias felt something shift in him, a kind of respect that ran bone deep. He moved to the corner, grabbing an old iron wrench from his duffel. "You take the door. I'll take the window." The seconds stretched like wire. Outside glass crunched under heavy boots. A faint whisper of laughter followed. Then came the first knock, loud, deliberate. "Hey, old man," a voice slurred. "You in there? We just want to talk." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "They sound drunk. Doesn't make them less dangerous," Elias muttered. The second knock came harder, rattling the chair braced against the handle. "Open up." The pup stirred at the noise, letting out a small whimper. Lyra's ears twitched. She rose unsteadily, her body tense, eyes fixed on the door. Elias crouched beside her, whispering, "Stay low, girl, not yet." But Lyra didn't understand, waiting when danger came close. The third hit slammed against the door so hard the frame cracked. Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos. "You picked the wrong house," she called, her tone like iron. "Ain't nothing here for you but regret." The men laughed, the sound cruel. "Lady, you got no idea what we'll take." They rammed the door again. The chair splintered. Elias felt something ignite inside him, the same spark that once drove him through fire and smoke, the same will that refused to die, even when the war ended. The old instincts roared awake. "Get behind me," he told Evelyn. She shook her head. "You're not doing this alone." The door burst open with a crash, wood splintering into the room. The two men stumbled in, one clutching a knife, the other still bleeding from his bandaged leg. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then chaos exploded. Elias swung the wrench hard, catching the first man in the ribs. The second lunged forward, but Evelyn stepped in without hesitation, swinging the bat with all her strength. It cracked against his arm, the sound sharp and final. He shouted in pain, dropping the knife. "You crazy old—" His words cut off as Lyra lunged from the side teeth, clamping onto his sleeve. Elias grabbed the first man by the collar and shoved him into the wall, shouting, "Get out before I finish what the dog started." The man gasped, eyes wide with shock. "We just you wanted nothing but trouble," Evelyn snapped, raising the bat again. The men stumbled back toward the door, limping, clutching their wounds. "You tell your kind," she hissed. "You don't come hunting in my street again." They fled into the night, their footsteps fading down the alley. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Evelyn leaned against the counter, catching her breath. Elias dropped the wrench, his hands shaking from adrenaline. The first light of dawn crawled across the city like a tired breath, thin and gray. The heater still hummed faintly in Evelyn's apartment, the sound mingling with the distant cry of a passing train. Elias dozed upright against the wall, his arm resting over Lyra's back, the pup tucked against his chest. The night's violence had left its mark, the door half-broken glass on the floor, but peace had settled again, fragile as a thread. Evelyn sat in the kitchen chair, eyes closed, her hand still gripping the wooden bat. Outside, the sky carried the soft smell of rain and something darker smoke. It slithered between buildings, invisible at first, then thick enough to sting the throat. Down in the alley, one of the men who had fled the night before stood hunched beneath a flickering streetlight. His face was bruised, his pride shattered, and hatred burned behind his eyes. "Old man thinks he can humiliate me," he muttered, fumbling with a bottle and rag. His hands shook, whether from fear or fury, even he didn't know. He struck a match, the flame catching the soaked cloth. For one bitter second he stared at it, then hurled the bottle toward the apartment window. It shattered on impact fire, blooming in an instant, hungry and alive. The explosion jolted Elias awake. He coughed hard, the acrid taste of smoke filling his lungs. Flames licked up the curtains, crackling across the peeling wallpaper. "Evelyn!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. The older woman stirred, eyes widening. "Lord Almighty, get the dogs!" she yelled, grabbing a blanket to smother the spreading flames. Lyra barked once, a sharp command that cut through the chaos. She darted towards the pup, nudging it toward Elias, her instincts snapping into focus. But the smoke was thickening fast, rolling through the room in choking waves. Elias stumbled toward the door, only to find it blocked by falling debris from the ceiling. Heat seared his face, and the walls groaned with the sound of wood surrendering. He dropped to his knees, pulling his coat over the pup, shouting for Evelyn, but his voice came out hoarse. The veteran in him recognized the sound, the deep roar of destruction, the same he'd heard once on a ship's deck when fire had swallowed steel. Panic twisted through him, sharper than the smoke. He crawled toward the window, but the flames had already claimed the frame. He turned back to find Evelyn pushing through the haze with a wet towel over her mouth. "Basement exit," she rasped. Behind the pantry, she disappeared into the smoke. Lyra, half-choked but determined, darted ahead of him, barking in short bursts to guide the way. The heat was unbearable now, every breath a knife. Elias tried to stand, but stumbled, disoriented. The world narrowed to a blur of red and gray. He felt something tug at his sleeve. Lyra's teeth pulling him towards the back hallway. "Go," he coughed, but she refused to let go. His strength faltered, and the darkness behind his eyes swelled. The last thing he saw before collapsing was the flash of Lyra's golden eyes through the smoke. When consciousness returned, the air was cold again, heavy with rain. He was lying on the cracked pavement outside the building, his head against the curb. His ears rang, his body trembling. He blinked and saw the apartment window above him belching smoke. Beside him lay Lyra, her fur-singed chest heaving. Her paws were raw and bleeding from clawing through glass. You dragged me out," he murmured, voice barely a whisper. She blinked slowly, her tail twitching once in answer. He pushed himself up, dizzy, searching. "Evelyn," he shouted. For a terrifying moment there was no reply. Then the door burst open and the old woman stumbled out, coughing, wrapped in a blanket the tiny pup cradled against her chest. "I got him," she wheezed, falling to her knees beside them. "Little thing's all right?" Elias exhaled relief, flooding through the pain. He looked back at the apartment as flames climbed higher, devouring everything that had made it home. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Rain began to fall in earnest, now hissing against the fire. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "That's everything I had," she said softly, watching the flames consume her walls, her pictures, her life. Elias turned to her, his face grim but steady. "No," he said, "not everything. You still got breath, and so do they." She gave a weak smile. "You sound like a man who's seen worse. I have," he admitted, "but this time it's not going to end the same way." He reached for Lyra, brushing ash from her fur. "You saved me, girl," he said, his throat thick. "You carried me out like a comrade." His words broke something inside him, the wall he'd built since the war, the silence that had kept him alive, but hollow. He remembered the heat of explosions at sea, the screams, the feeling of dragging friends who never woke again. Now, in this smoke-soaked alley, he saw those memories reflected in the dog's eyes, loyalty without hesitation, love without condition. Evelyn looked between them, her expression softening through the pain. "She's your soldier now," she said quietly. "The good Lord knew you needed her as much as she needed you." Elias nodded, the firelight flickering in his wet eyes. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around Lyra's body. "Then I guess it's time I start fighting like I deserve her." The fire truck arrived moments later, red lights spinning through the fog. Paramedics rushed forward, but Elias waved them toward Evelyn first. "She needs help," he said. "And the pup." They tried to pull him aside, but he resisted until he saw Lyra loaded gently into a blanket by one of the responders. Only then did he let himself sit down, his breath ragged. The firemen worked fast, hosing down the building, the water turning to steam as it hit the walls. When the blaze finally died, only the blackened frame of the apartment remained. Evelyn sat beside him on the curb, a paramedic wrapping her in a clean blanket. "Guess the city finally got its way," she said, staring at the ruin. Elias gave a faint, tired smile. "Buildings can burn," he said, "but not everything worth keeping does." She turned her head toward him. "So what now?" He looked down at the pup, now swaddled and shivering, but alive then, at Lyra, whose chest rose and fell with slow determination. "We rebuild," he said simply. "That's what soldiers do." She nodded, tears cutting paths through the soot on her cheeks. "Then maybe this time rebuild somewhere the world can't take from you." The rain eased, and dawn finally broke a clean, fragile light, spreading over the soaked ruins. Elias stood picking up the pup and glancing down at Lyra. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "We're not done yet." The dog stirred, lifting her head despite the pain, and pressed her nose against his hand. Together they turned from the wreckage, 3 survivors walking through the wet morning. Behind them, smoke curled like ghosts rising into the sky, but ahead waited something they hadn't had before: direction. For the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of purpose settle in his chest, not like a burden, but like a heartbeat returning. The smoke still clung to Elias's jacket even after 2 days. The scent of loss burned into the fabric like a memory that refused to fade. The firefighters had put out the blaze, the police had taken statements, and the city had moved on as if nothing had happened. But Elias couldn't. The sight of Evelyn's apartment turning to ash replayed behind his eyelids every time he blinked. She had lost everything yet. When he'd tried to thank her, she had only smiled and said, "Ain't nothing lost if you still got breath to give." She had refused to go with him, saying she needed to stay behind to help the neighbors whose lives were still smoldering in the aftermath. So that morning, with a patched duffel over his shoulder and both dogs bundled close, Elias had boarded a northbound bus. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that the city had taken too much from all of them. The bus windows were fogged with condensation, the rain outside relentless. Lyra rested on the seat beside him, her head on his lap, while the tiny pup who still didn't have a name slept in the crook of his coat. The world outside blurred into streaks of gray and green. Every so often, Elias caught his reflection in the window, the deep lines across his face, the eyes dulled by years of noise and smoke, now softened by something he didn't quite recognize purpose. For the first time since he'd left the Navy, he wasn't just running from ghosts. He was running towards something. He glanced at Lyra and smiled faintly. "We're going to find quiet, girl. Real quiet. The kind they can't burn down." The bus rumbled over potholes, the driver muttering curses at the rain. Hours passed. The city thinned into empty highways and scattered gas stations. Lyra shifted uneasily, her ears twitching. Elias frowned. "Easy now," he said softly. But before he could settle her, the bus shuddered violently. The engine coughed once, twice, then died with a metallic groan. The driver slammed on the brakes, and the bus lurched to a stop on the shoulder of the road. "That's it," the driver said, thumping the steering wheel. "She's done for." Passengers grumbled, gathering their belongings. Elias peered through the window. They were in the middle of nowhere. Fields stretching out under a bruised sky, no buildings in sight. Rain beat against the windshield in sheets. "How far to the next town?" he asked. The driver shrugged. 10 miles, maybe 15. Tow truck will take an hour." Elias looked at Lyra, then at the tiny pup stirring inside his coat. They couldn't wait that long. The air inside the bus was already cooling fast. "We'll walk," he muttered. The driver raised an eyebrow. In this weather, Elias gave a tired smile. "I've walked through worse." He stepped out into the rain, pulling his coat tight around the pup. Lyra followed, limping slightly, but determined. The cold bit through his clothes instantly. The asphalt gleamed slick and endless. They walked along the shoulder heads bowed against the wind. The rain blurred the world into shapes and noise. Once or twice headlights approached, but each time Elias waved, the cars sped past drivers, staring before vanishing into the fog. When one pickup slowed, his heart lifted only for it to accelerate again when the driver noticed the bleeding shepherd at his side. He stood there for a moment, rain streaming down his face, and felt something old and bitter rise in him. The world had grown so small, so scared, that kindness was treated like danger. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Guess it's just us again," he said quietly. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes steady as if to say that was enough. The pup whimpered, and he adjusted his coat to shield it from the rain. They kept walking. Hours seemed to stretch. His injured leg began to throb. The fields around them blurred into endless gray. Just as exhaustion began to cloud his vision, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, small and warm like a lantern in fog. He blinked, unsure if it was real, but Lyra lifted her head and barked, once low and certain. "You see it too," he murmured. They followed the faint glow until the outline of a farmhouse emerged from the mist, its windows glowing gold against the storm. A man stepped out onto the porch wearing a heavy coat and holding a flashlight. "You lost," he called out. His voice carried the rough kindness of someone used to helping strangers. Elias hesitated. "Bus broke down 10 miles back," he said. "We've been walking." The man's gaze dropped to Lyra and the bundle in Elias's arms. You've got dogs? 2, Elias replied. They're hurt, but they're good. The man nodded once. Get inside before you freeze solid. Elias blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. You mean it wouldn't have said it if I didn't? The man held the door open, and warm light spilled onto the porch. Elias stepped inside, the sudden heat almost dizzying. A woman stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She turned her face kind and lined by years of work. "Oh, Lord," she said softly. "Get them blankets, Harold." The farmer Harold grabbed a pile of quilts and handed them over. Elias knelt on the wooden floor, setting the pup down gently, while Lyra collapsed beside him, tail thumping weakly. The woman crouched down. "That one's been through hell," she murmured. "All of you have." Elias nodded, his throat tightening. "We just needed somewhere dry." She smiled. "You'll have that and a meal, too. No one walks through this rain and gets turned away in my house." The words hit him harder than expected. He sat there in silence as she laid a blanket over Lyra and another around his shoulders. The smell of soup filled the room, rich and comforting. For the first time in weeks, the ache in his chest eased. Harold sat at the table, lighting a lantern. "Name's Harold Fisher," he said. "This here's my wife, Marlene." "You Elias Ward," he answered. "Served in the Navy. Been a long road since." Harold nodded, eyes steady. "Well, sailor, you're safe here tonight." Marlene set 3 bowls on the table, one for him, one with water for Lyra, and another smaller one for the pup. "You got more family out there?" she asked gently. Elias looked down, shaking his head. "Just them." She smiled softly. "Sometimes that's the only kind that matters." Lyra drank slowly, lifting her head once to meet his eyes. He reached down, brushing his hand through her fur. "We're home for now," he whispered. The rain continued outside, but inside the small farmhouse, time seemed to stop. Harold told stories of his years in the fields Marlene hummed while she cleaned, and for the first time since the bridge, Elias felt like part of something living again. As the night wore on, he sat by the window watching the rain taper off. The moon broke through silver and pale. He turned to see Lyra asleep by the fire, the pup curled against her belly. Evelyn's words came back to him. "Sometimes God closes buildings, so we'll open hearts instead." He smiled faintly. Maybe that was true. Maybe survival wasn't just about fighting. Maybe it was about finding where you still belonged. Elias stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the man work with steady, patient strength. "You sleep any?" Harold called without looking up. "Some," Elias replied. Lyra kept watch. Old habits. Harold chuckled. "That dog's got the soul of a soldier." Elias smiled faintly, his eyes following Lyra trotting along the edge of the field. She was still thin, her gait stiff, but her spirit was unbroken. The pup, now lively and curious, chased a butterfly through the wet grass, tumbling over his own paws. Marlene appeared behind Elias, handing him a second cup. "You should help him, you know," she said kindly. "Keeps the mind busy." Elias nodded, setting the mug down. "You're right." He pulled on Harold's spare coat and joined him at the fence. The morning sun warmed his back, and for a moment he forgot the weight he carried. They worked side by side in silence, the rhythm of hammering and the smell of fresh hay wrapping around them like a hymn. "You're good with your hands," Harold said after a while. "Guess the Navy taught you more than ships." Elias wiped sweat from his brow. "The Navy taught me how to rebuild what breaks." Harold nodded approvingly. "That's a good thing to remember." Hours passed easily. Lyra watched from the shade tail wagging faintly, while the pup darted in and out of the barn, chasing shadows. The peace felt so complete that Elias didn't notice the clouds creeping in until the wind changed. The sky darkened to slate. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. Harold looked up. "Storm wasn't on the forecast," he muttered. "Help me get the animals in." They hurried towards the barn, the wind picking up fast. Rain began in thin needles, turning to heavy sheets within minutes. The horses whinnied restless in their stalls. Elias moved quickly, securing the door while Harold checked the beams. The lightning came fast, followed by the crack of thunder that shook the ground. "We'll ride it out," Harold said, shouting over the wind. But fate had other plans. A gust stronger than the rest tore through the valley, snapping a dead tree near the ridge. The sound was deafening, a crack, then a crash as it fell slamming against the barn's roof. Wood splintered, dust and hay exploded into the air. Down Elias yelled, grabbing Harold and dragging him aside as part of the roof caved in. When the noise settled, the barn was half collapsed, rain pouring through the broken beams. "You all right?" Elias asked. Harold groaned, but nodded. "Where's the pup?" Elias froze. The small shape that had been darting near the hay moments ago was gone. Lyra barked once, sharp and urgent ears flat against her skull. She lunged toward the fallen timbers, sniffing, whining. Elias grabbed a lantern from the wall, lighting it with shaking hands. "Stay here," he told Harold, but the old man shook his head. "The hell I will." Together they moved through the debris, calling the pup's name. Lyra's barking grew frantic near the back corner. "He's under here," Elias shouted, spotting movement beneath a collapsed beam. The pup's tiny paw pushed weakly against the rubble. The beam was too heavy to lift alone. Elias braced his shoulder against it, muscles screaming, rain and sweat blinding him. "Come on," he growled, pushing until his vision swam. Lyra leapt beside him, digging through hay and shards of wood. "Pull him, girl," he gasped. "Come on!" She wedged her body under the gap, teeth gripping the pup's scruff. With one final heave, Elias lifted the beam just enough for her to drag the pup free. They both stumbled back as the roof groaned and collapsed further behind them. He dropped to his knees, gasping. The pup coughed, shook, then let out a weak bark. Alive. Lyra licked him furiously, whining with relief. Elias exhaled laughter, breaking through his ragged breath. "Good girl," he whispered. "You did it again." The storm raged on, but the fire in his chest was stronger now, a spark that had nothing to do with adrenaline. It was love, raw and unashamed. Harold limped over, clutching his arm. "You're both insane," he said, voice shaking. "But I'll be damned if that wasn't the bravest thing I've seen." Elias looked at Lyra, rain dripping from her muzzle, and nodded. "She doesn't know how to quit." They carried the pup inside the farmhouse, Marlene rushing to meet them with towels and blankets. "Mercy," she gasped, wrapping the pup tight. "He's freezing." Elias knelt beside the fire, rubbing Lyra's fur dry. Her breathing was fast, but her eyes were calm. "You keep saving everyone but yourself," he said softly. Marlene touched his shoulder. "That's what mothers do, honey." He looked up at her eyes, wet. She's not even his real mother. Marlene smiled. "Doesn't matter. Love's not about who's born to who. It's about who stays when it hurts." Her words hit him like a wave. He looked at the pup, now nestled against Lyra's chest. Safe again. The spring air smelled of hay and rain, warm enough to wake the earth, but still sharp enough to remind a man where he came from. The Fisher farm had changed in the months since that storm, the barn rebuilt with new beams, the fences standing straight again, and laughter echoing from the fields where once there had been silence. Elias walked through the pasture with a steady limp, his boots coated in mud, the morning sun glinting off the small medal he now wore again on a leather cord around his neck. It wasn't for pride. It was for remembrance. Lyra trotted beside him slower these days, but proud, her coat fuller, her gait deliberate. The pup, now taller, his fur golden against the green, ran ahead through the grass, chasing butterflies the same way he had the first day he saw daylight. "Easy boy," Elias called, smiling faintly. "Your mother can't keep up like she used to." Lyra barked once, low and playful, as if pretending to argue. She had healed as best she could, but age and scars had taken their toll. Some mornings she struggled to rise, and when she walked, her body swayed slightly. Yet her eyes remained bright, the eyes of a creature who had fought death and won too many times to be afraid of it anymore. Harold leaned on the fence nearby, watching them. "She's slowing down," he said softly. Elias nodded. "Yeah, I can feel it." "You ready for when she ain't?" Elias stared across the field where the pup had stopped to dig a hole near the big willow that stood by the edge of the property. "No," he said quietly, "but she deserves peace when it comes." That afternoon, Elias worked on the barn roof, hammering nails in rhythm with the hum of bees and the sound of Marlene singing inside the house. The sun dipped low, spilling gold over the hills. He climbed down, wiping sweat from his brow, and whistled for the dogs. The pup came running first, tail high, tongue lolling. But Lyra didn't follow. "Go get her," he told the pup. But the young dog only circled him anxiously, whining. Elias felt his stomach tighten. He crossed the pasture quickly, his limp forgotten. He found her lying in the tall grass near the willow, the wind stirring her fur like a farewell. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed. "No," he whispered, dropping to his knees. "Not now, girl." She lifted her head weakly tail, giving one last thump against the ground. The pup whined beside them, nudging her muzzle. Lyra looked at Elias, her gaze steady and calm. He understood without words. She wasn't afraid. She was tired. He cradled her head in his lap, his rough hands trembling. "You've done enough," he said softly. "You can rest now." She blinked slowly, pressing her nose against his wrist the same way she had done under that bridge when everything began. Her breathing grew faint, then paused. The world around them went still, the wind slowing, the sky dimming, as if the earth itself held its breath. Elias bowed his head, his tears falling into her fur. "You carried me farther than I ever deserved," he whispered. "You found me when I didn't want to be found." He sat there until the stars began to appear. The pup curled quietly beside her body, refusing to move. Harold came later with a lantern, saying nothing, just placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. Together they buried her beneath the willow tree that overlooked the field, where the wind always whispered like the sea. The next morning, Elias carved a small wooden marker and set it in the soil. On it he wrote with a steady hand, "She taught me to stand again." Marlene brought wildflowers and placed them at the base. The pup lay nearby, watching, understanding in the silent way dogs always do. Days passed, then weeks, and life continued because that was what Lyra had taught him, to keep walking no matter the road. Elias took over much of the farm work, his limp easing with time. The pup grew strong, lean and loyal, shadowing him through every field. Sometimes in the quiet before dusk, Elias would pause by the willow and speak aloud, though no one was there to hear. "We made it, girl," he'd say. "You can rest easy." On one such evening, as the sun burned orange across the horizon, Harold joined him by the tree. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. Elias shook his head. "Back to what the city's gone. The Navy's done." "This." He gestured to the field, to the farmhouse, glowing with lamplight. "This is home now." Harold nodded, smiling. "You know, Marlene said she ain't seen the dogs this happy in years. Says it's because they got someone who listens." Elias laughed softly. "Maybe it's because I finally learned how." He looked down at the pup, who wagged his tail once and rested his head against his boot. "She left him ready," Elias murmured. "Strong, brave, just like her." The air grew cool and crickets began to sing. The willow leaves swayed above them, whispering like the soft surf of memory. Elias felt peace settle into his bones, the kind that comes when a man stops running. He thought of Evelyn's voice, of Harold's laughter, of Lyra's eyes staring through the smoke and rain, and he realized something he hadn't before, that every soul that had crossed his path had handed him a piece of the life he'd thought he lost. He knelt beside the marker, pressing his hand to the earth. "I kept the promise," he whispered. I stayed standing. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, he sat on the porch with the pup at his feet, listening to the wind moving through the grass. The world was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Somewhere out in the dark, a nightbird called a single, lingering note that sounded almost like a name. The pup lifted his head, ears pricking, and Elias smiled. "She's still watching," he said, "and we'll keep watch too." In the silence that followed, the veteran, the dog, and the land breathed as one. Life had begun again, not through miracles or luck, but through the stubborn grace of survival. Under the willow tree where courage met rest, the promise lived on, unbroken, eternal, and carried forward in every heartbeat that refused to give up. If this story touched you, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and help more people find it. Tell us what moment hit you hardest, and where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Every story we share keeps their memory and their message of loyalty alive.